true and very depressing for a researcher, because I know that that statistic is also going to include my mom. So, to be honest, there's only 6 people that read these studies on an average basis, which means we've been studying this incredible science of happiness, and yet it's not getting out to people. Because you're so busy with your lives and your families, you probably don't take time every morning to read through the top-tier psychology journal articles about how we're supposed to be happier. So this huge gap exists between what we've been learning in science and what we've been doing in our lives. So what I'd love to do is to share that research with you today, because it's transformed not only my life, but I think, having watched you over the past 2 days, I think we can create a movement that's starting here. And that I'm so excited about. But in order to do that, we need to go deep into this research, and I want to start where I started with this research. And I started doing this research when I was just 7 years old. So if any of you have children, and they're 7, and they're not doing academic research, you're clearly not pushing them hard enough. When I was 7 and my sister was 5 years old, we were playing on top of a bunk bed. How many of you have bunk beds? Had bunk beds? A lot of you. I love them. I would still have them now if they were socially acceptable. But on one side, my sister was 2 years younger than me at the time, and she's 2 years younger than me now. But at the time, that meant she had to do everything I wanted to do, and I wanted to play war. So on one side of the bunk bed, I had all of my G.I. Joe soldiers and weaponry lined up. And on her side, she had all of her My Little Ponies and unicorns ready for this cavalry charge. And I wasn't concerned about what would happen, because I had won this war every time we had played in the past. And there are differing accounts of what happened that afternoon, but since my sister was not invited to Tampa, you get to hear the true story. Which is, my sister was a little bit on the clumsy side, and somehow, without any help or push from her loving older brother at all, suddenly Amy disappeared off of the top of the bunk bed and landed with this crash on the floor. And I nervously peered over the side of the bed to see what had befallen my fallen sister, and saw that she landed painfully on her hands and knees on all fours on the ground. Now, I was nervous because my parents had charged me with making sure that my sister and I played as safely and as quietly as possible. And seeing as how I'd accidentally broken Amy's arm just 1 week before. Don't take her side, you don't even know her. I was heroically trying to push her out of the way of an oncoming imaginary sniper bullet from Cobra Commander, for which I have yet to be thanked. She didn't even see it coming, and I was trying as hard as I could to be on my best behavior, and I saw on my sister's face this wail of pain and suffering and surprise, threatening to erupt from her mouth and threatening to wake my parents from the long winter's nap for which they had settled. So I did the only thing that my little frantic 7-year-old brain could think to do to avert this tragedy. And if you have children, you've seen this hundreds of times before. I said, Amy, wait, please don't cry. Did you see how you landed? No human lands on all fours like that. She stopped mid-cry with confusion on her face and looked up, and I had no idea where this is going. That was the extent of my strategy. So I blurted out the only thing my brain could think of, which is, Amy, I think you're a unicorn. Which was cheating, because there's nothing in the world Amy would want more at that moment to not be Amy, the hurt 5-year-old little sister, but Amy, the special unicorn. Of course, an option that was open to her brain at no point in the past, and you could see on my poor, manipulated sister's face conflict as her brain attempted to devote resources to feeling the pain and suffering and surprise she'd experienced falling off of this bunk bed, or contemplating this newfound identity as a unicorn. And the latter won out. Instead of crying, instead of ceasing our play, instead of waking my parents from the long winter's nap that they were settled for, instead a smile spread across her face, and she bounded right back up onto the bunk bed with all the grace of a baby unicorn. With one broken leg. What we had stumbled across at that tender age of 5 and 7. We had no idea at the time of something that was going to be in the vanguard of a scientific revolution occurring 2 decades later in the way that we understand the human brain. What we learned is that the human brain is like a single processor in a computer. We have a limited amount of resources to experience the world, which means that if our brain, as we're scanning and look at the world, our brain can process 40 bits of information per second, which is so fast. But we receive 11 million pieces of information every second from our nerve endings, which means our reality, we're picking and choosing constantly. Which means scientifically, happiness is actually a choice. It's a choice about how our brain decides to look at the world. If we scan the world for the negatives, the hassles, and the complaints first, and maybe you know people that are like that. They can walk into any room and they can find the thing to complain about immediately. Those people are not bad people. Their brains are experts at scanning the world for the negatives and hassles first. The problem is, our brains are limited. What we scan for first becomes our reality. What we found is we literally have no brain left over to scan the world for the things that make us grateful in the present moment, the meaning embedded in our lives, and the ways of transforming this present reality into a better reality. What we've stumbled across is a new field called positive psychology, which changes the way we look at human beings. What we discovered is, not only can we raise people's levels of happiness, but in doing so, we can improve your health outcomes, your business outcomes, your educational outcomes for children. It turns out the human brain has an incredible advantage of positive, if we can choose how to do that. What I'd like to talk about is how we do that. So here's what I'd like to start with. When I first got into this, they said, if you're going to start doing this research and spreading this out to people, whatever you do, don't start your talks with a lot of graphs or data or research. But where I'd like to start today, I'd like to start with a graph. This graph looks boring. This graph is the reason that I get excited and wake up every morning, which means I live a very, very exciting life. Each of these dots represents an individual. I could be plotting anything here. Now, if I was studying you, which I would love to do, I would love to find out, well, I'm jumping ahead, I want to tell you about that. If this is the data I got back studying you, I would be thrilled as a researcher. Because look, there's very clearly a trend that's going on there in the data, and that means that I can get published, which is all that matters. The fact that there's one weird red dot that's up above the curve, there's one weirdo in this room. You know who you are. Everyone knows who you are. That's no problem. That's no problem because we can just delete you. We can delete you because you are clearly a measurement error. And I know that you're an error because you're messing up my data. So one of the very first things we teach people in economics, in statistics, in business, in government courses is how, in a valid way, can we eliminate the weirdo from our data? Because what I'm interested in is the average. I want to find out how many aspirin or Advil the average person should take. What I'm fascinated by is this. That's great if I'm asking questions like that, but as soon as we start asking questions as humans about potential, about intelligence, about creativity, about energy levels, about health, we're asking questions about potential. What we found is if we start doing science like this, we create what I call the cult of the average, which many of you might have seen in your lives. What we see is that if we ask a question like, how fast can a child learn how to read in the classroom? Scientists change the answer to, here's how fast the average child learns how to read in that classroom. And we tailor the class right towards the average, forgetting the fact that many of us read much slower than the average, or much faster than the average. Now, if you fall below average in your company, then psychologists get thrilled, because that means you're either depressed, or you have a disorder, or hopefully both. We're hoping for both because we have a different business model than you. Our business model is if you come into a therapy session with one problem, we want to make sure you leave knowing you've got 10 problems. We'll go all the way back into your childhood to prove this to you, but eventually the role of traditional psychology is how do we make you normal? But normal is merely average. And what I posit, and what positive psychology found, is that if we study what is merely average, we will remain merely average. In our companies, in our schools, worldwide. Instead of deleting these outliers, which is you, everyone in this room is an outlier for something. You're above the curve for your courage, for your intelligence, for your creativity, for your energy, your musical ability, your athletic ability, whatever it is that causes you to be an outlier, don't let us delete you. Let us learn from you about how we can move people not up to the average, but how we can move the entire average up in this world. That's where I get excited. And that, I believe, is exactly what you're doing. And the reason I want to share this, and the reason I felt that there's this natural synergy with It Works, is because when I turn on the news, you've heard this before, it's about murder and corruption and diseases and natural disasters, and very quickly your brain starts to think, okay, Shaun, that's the real ratio. There's a lot more negative to all the few positive things that are going on in our world. That changes us. It creates what we call the medical school syndrome. During the first year of medical training, as these brilliant doctors read through all the symptoms and diseases that could happen to a human being, many of these brilliant doctors start thinking that they have all of those symptoms and diseases. They actually start manifesting it. I have a brother-in-law named Bobo, which is a whole other story how that happens. Bobo married Amy the unicorn, which makes sense. He became a pediatrician, but Bobo called me on the phone from Yale Medical School, our rival, and he said, Shaun, I have leprosy. Which even at Yale is extraordinarily rare, but I had no idea how to console poor Bobo because he had just gone over an entire week of menopause. See, what we're finding is it's not necessarily the reality that shapes us. It's the lens through which we view the world that shapes how we experience reality. What I'd love to do is to do a brief experiment with you. This, I think, is the biggest experiment I've done all in one time. So I'm so excited to see how this works. So thank you for inviting me to do this. I can't help myself, but here's what I'd love for you to do. You don't have to do my experiment. I'm not allowed to bring consent forms to talks anymore after the electric shock problem a couple times ago. But if you're willing to participate, all I need you to do is just to partner up with someone who's sitting next to you. Partner up into pairs of two. Before you do that, I'm legally required, at least in the United States, to tell you that you cannot partner up with someone that you're married to, or someone that you want to be married to, so move around if you need to. Partner up with somebody sitting next to you very quickly in pairs of two, of course pairs of two, and then pairs. Does everyone have a partner? Non-marital material? Okay, here's what I'd like you to do. The person that's sitting closest to me right now, you're person number one in the pair. For those, you can just pick down the road if you want to be. Whoever seems closest to me, you're person number one. Yeah, there's person number two. There should be a 1 and a 2 in each group. Raise your hand for person number one. Raise your hand for person number two. That is not the experiment, so don't get excited. But I have to do that now because I did this experiment on Wall Street with these bankers, and it literally took them 5 minutes to figure out who number one in the group was. Which explains what's going on there. So here's what I'd love for you to do. How many of you have a psychology background? You love psychology books, you studied psychology, raise your hand. So for my psychology friends, this is the emotional prime of the experiment. For everyone else, this is nothing. Over the course of your life, you've taken your genetic predispositions, your genes, and you've built those up through your self-discipline and your self-control. You're able to pass the classes you needed to school, to apply yourselves to your family lives, and to be part of this. You wouldn't be here if you didn't have incredible self-discipline and control and willpower. What I'd love for you to do is to use all of that you've been cultivating since you started crawling, and I'd like you to use that to control your behavior with your partner for 7 seconds of this experiment. Person number one, what we ask you to do is to not get angry with person number two when they do to you what I'm about to tell them to do. Person number one, don't get angry, don't get sad, please don't cry like the group last week. She was so kind. In fact, person number one, what I'd like you to do is just to do nothing with your partner. So person number one and two, please turn and face one another. Person number one, make sure you're within striking distance of person number two. And person number one, go neutral on the inside. Try to feel no emotions and try and think no thoughts, which for some of you is going to be much easier than others. Then what I'd like you to do is just control your behavior, person number one. Control your thoughts. Try and have no thoughts. Try and control your emotions. Don't move your hands, person number one, to defend yourself. And don't show any emotion on your face. No fear, no flinching, no frustration, nothing. I want you to use your decades of self-discipline and control to control yourself, person number one. Then person number two, please look at them. Make sure you're looking at them directly in the eyes. For the next 7 seconds, person number two, please smile genuinely and warmly directly up into the eyes of person number one. Go.